Good morning, everybody. So pleased to see everyone. My name is Owen Holmes. I'm a proud Titan. Hey. An emeritus of Cal State Fullerton, a lecturer, chief troublemaker, chair of the Royce International Symposium. I'd like to welcome everybody. Thanks for coming in on this It Never Rains in Southern California day. And finally, at 10 o'clock, it stopped raining. So it's good to see all the friends and newcomers and our students. We have 60 students with us today. Let's give them a hand. I'd like to also just thank the Richard Nixon Foundation for their support as a partner for this. We appreciate the support of that partnership. In addition to recognizing Ed Royce as one of our distinguished alums and to honor him and his vision as statesman during his years in Congress, the symposium serves to elevate public knowledge and engagement about world events. We find ourselves at a pivotal juncture in history where both geopolitical shifts and our domestic politics are redefining contours of international relations. Now is the time for the United States and our allies to meet this challenge with the full range of our powers. That's what the symposium is designed around, both hard and soft powers we're talking about. We must strengthen military readiness and alliances, but we must also harness the unmatched power of the United States diplomacy, economic influence, and cultural leadership. Foreign policy analysts and observers theorize that a United States that does this while recognizing limits of that power will come and it will strengthen our international presence. This symposium has been designed to do just that. We are again fortunate to have Ed, who is going to continue this theme as our keynote speaker. After lunch, the planning committee has secured a panel of experts to continue the discussion and provide their perspectives on our theme. Bios of our speakers, panelists, and moderators are available in your program, so please take a look at that. Without significant sponsors, partners, and donors to support the symposium, it would not be possible. So on the back of your program, there is a QR code. Take your smartphone out and make a donation. It would really help us to continue these dialogues. Also, you'll see on the screen as it rotates, there's another Scan Me if you miss it in the program. The Planning Committee wishes to thank our sponsors Brownstein, the Richard Nixon Foundation, Southern California Gas Company, and CSUF alumnus Paul Carter for their support. We're also grateful to our promotional partners, the Orange County Register as our exclusive media partner, Cal State Fullerton's Dean's Office, Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Department of Political Science. Also, the Orange County Forum and the World Affairs Council, Orange County. Finally, I want to thank the so many people who have had a role in planning and coordinating a program such as this. In your program is a list of acknowledgments of those that have made this symposium a reality. Particularly, I want to thank Ed and Marie for their support and my fellow planning committee members. Also, thanks to Sophia Chang, Pia Claudio, and Amber Cabrera for event coordination and support. Thanks to our student engagement donors also, who provided complimentary seating for our students, more than double the attendance from last year. Thank you all for helping make this year such a success. And the last bit I'd want to thank, the Richard Nixon Foundation staff have been excellent every year, and let's give them a hand for helping us out, okay? Thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dean Jessica Stern of College of Humanities and Social Sciences, who will introduce President Rochon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I texted my best friend today and I said, it's so rainy and cozy. If it were any other day, I'd want to stay in bed, but like the Royce Symposium is literally my favorite day of the year. I just think that everything that I learn here, seeing our students flourish, it's such a pleasure. And I'm so excited to introduce President Rochon to experience his first Royce Symposium. President Rashawn became our 10th president in July, and we are so lucky that we were able to seize him from the University of Southern Indiana, where he served as a president. He's a first-generation college student. He earned his bachelor's degree at Tuskegee University and his master's and doctoral degree at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's a specialist in educational policy with an emphasis on educational history and policy analysis. He has spent about 3 decades really serving in higher education roles. And what I appreciate is that he's served in all the major roles, from chair to dean to provost, a leader in student affairs. So we're really in good hands with somebody who understands how institutions work. And for the purposes of today, I want to highlight how committed President Rashawn has demonstrated himself to be in increasing international awareness. He has championed initiatives that encourage student and faculty exchanges, collaborative research projects, and partnerships with universities worldwide. And his efforts have significantly contributed to broadening the international perspective within academic communities and preparing students to thrive in a globalized world. So this is really, he is in his wheelhouse right here, and my pleasure to introduce President Rashawn.
Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, y'all are asleep. Oh my. They don't know this president. Good afternoon. You know, I have some prepared words that I'm going to share with you. But Mr. Royce, he whispered to me before I got up to the stage. He said, stretch it out a little bit so I can just get down. I can wolf down some food. So, Mr. Royce, I'm going to do my very best, sir, okay? All right, before they boo me off this stage. You know, I want to just segue for a second. You know, Dean Stern, thank you so much for the kind introduction. You know, but she said something about me that is so true. I'm the first one in my family to go to college and seek a degree. And I remember, I'll share this story with a couple of folks in my life, that going to Tuskegee University just changed my trajectory and my understanding of what was possible. And sitting in this library right now having lunch, just looking at the definition on the walls and the chandelier, I'm not sure about you all, but I'm floored by where my life has gone, where my life has landed. And so for a kid from the south side of Chicago to be before this amazing crowd of individuals who are not only influencers, but policymakers and change makers. And the most important constituent in here are the 60 students. Yeah, the individuals who are, let's give them a round, yeah. So I am truly humbled by this opportunity. Good morning to everyone, good afternoon to everyone, and hello to the Titan family in particular. It is with great honor to welcome each of you all to the 4th annual Royce International Symposium in this historic library. This event has become an important platform for thoughtful discourse on global affairs, and I'm grateful to see our students, our alums, civic leaders here today present. I want to first extend my deepest appreciation to our distinguished host, former Congress member, the Honorable Ed Royce. Let's give him a round, please. As an alum of this institution, a respected leader in U.S. international relations, and also an amazing community leader, Mr. Royce continues engagement with Cal State Fullerton, and it is inspiring and also invaluable. Let me discuss the importance of this symposium the way I see it. We live in a time of rapid global change, and that's why conversations that we'll have today here are so vital, so important. Academic institutions like Cal State Fullerton play a key role in diplomacy. We are critical in fostering debate, analysis, and innovative solutions to address global challenges. Today's symposium connects academic inquiry with real-world policy challenges. For students in particular, this event offers an opportunity to move beyond the headlines, to examine the complexities of diplomacy and international relations. By encouraging open discourse, Mr. Royce, you just said about freedom of speech. We empower the next generation of leaders to approach diplomacy with intelligence and also with great integrity. I look forward to the insights that will emerge from today's symposium. Our role, our students will play a shaping initial essential component in the future of international relations. Let me discuss Mr. Royce with you for a second before I introduce him. Ed Royce served in the House of Representatives for nearly 3 decades, representing Orange County communities. He was known as a deal maker, period, crossing party lines to build bipartisan consensus and moving important legislation forward. As chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he spearheaded human rights, economic development, women's empowerment. Oh, by the way, happy Women's Heritage Month, everybody. Yeah, let's do that. That's good. Yes. And also security around our globe. His leadership in Congress leaves a lasting impact for generations to come. We also greatly appreciate Mr. Royce's commitment to student success and support of Cal State Fullerton. He championed the Cal State DC Scholars Program, ensuring students have valuable internship opportunities in our community and also in Washington, D.C. Let me close with this right here. His legacy continues at the Lawrence DeGraff Center for Oral and Public History, which houses the official congressional papers from his tenure as chair of the U.S. House of Foreign Affairs Committee. We are so grateful to his wife, Marie, also for your leadership, your commitment to our country, and also to Orange County. We're so thankful to have Mr. Royce here today. I close with this right here, Mr. Royce. I just asked you to share with me why this is such an important discussion about international relations. And he spoke to me about not only diplomacy, but about relationship building, about allyship, about common values, about our non-negotiable opportunity to open doors for those who deserve to walk through it. Mr. Royce, we are honored to have you, sir. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ed Royce.
Thank you very much, President Roshan. We very much I appreciate that kind introduction. And I think for me, one of the most moving aspects of that, as you stated, was that we have 60 students here from CSUF. I had an opportunity this morning to sit in on some of the dialogue as the students presented their papers, and as they are drawn into this process, those that are interested in foreign policy in particular. And I first want to introduce a fellow CSUF grad from Cal State Fullerton. My sister, Jennifer Winberg, is with us. And from Cal Poly Pomona, a graduate and then later an educator there and a former Assistant Secretary of State, my spouse, Marie Royce. But one of the topics which I was discussing with President Roshan, he was asking me about this circumstance of why we should be more engaged, why we should understand more, what motivates us to be concerned about the state of affairs in the world. And in particular, especially at a time when we have authoritarian governments around the globe that are beginning to collude. And that brings us to the topic of today's discussion. We'll have some panels afterwards, but American foreign policy in a destabilized world, hard, soft, and sharp power challenges. And as we think about these issues, our promotion of democracy, our outreach to our allies around the world, our strengthening of their position, And especially one thing that I noticed in 1985 when I was in Eastern Europe was the importance of soft power as it relates to broadcasting. I was there at a time when our broadcasts behind the Iron Curtain were particularly effective in making individuals who were under a totalitarian society realize some of the dreams that they had to see democracy, to have freedom of speech for themselves, to have free elections in their counties and in their cities and in their governments. And the impact of that on people is something that struck me as an example of how powerful these values of democracy and freedom really are. And so if we go back to the first real deployment of soft power and the first crisis that we saw was the Berlin airlift, for those of you, especially the students here who have studied the role of John F. Kennedy in making certain that U.S. aid was flown in to the people who otherwise would have starved in West Berlin. And on the top you see West Berliners, welcoming a drop from a U.S. aircraft bringing in food. And if you think back to that time, and I remember, the remarks of President Kennedy, Ich bin ein Berliner. I learned from my German teacher in high school, by the way, here in Orange County, that actually he had said, I am a jelly donut. But the reality for the Germans, including her, were that his attempt to convey this means he was quintessentially American, because they all knew Americans didn't really have that much of a command of languages, but secondarily just the American attitude that we stand with you, I stand with you. I, the President of the United States, am going to see that that aid goes in and that you are going to be able to sustain the pressure. And during those years, as the Soviets picked up their effort, NATO held and protected those people. Let me go to the scene you see below is just the East German guards building the Berlin Wall. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, these were the two most successful programs we had. And I shared with you my observation, just that when I was in Eastern Germany, in East Berlin, in Dresden, and in the evening we'd be talking to people, and they would share with us that they had to go listen to the broadcasts. They wanted to listen to Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and in particular they were learning what was happening actually across East Germany and across Europe, but also around the world. They were learning more because the individuals that we had broadcasting were from those communities. They were educated in the United States. They had escaped, from these captive nations. And their messages were very effective. But also President Reagan at that time traveled all across Europe, stressing to audiences that we needed a united front against totalitarianism, that we needed to push democratic ideals, that our ultimate goal was to actually give people the power to liberate themselves by making these concepts so well understood that individuals would change their own opinion about the direction, despite the disinformation that they were receiving every day in these totalitarian societies. Let me go to the next, go back one. As a result, the Berlin Wall came down, and the people in Poland, for example, when the Polish forces were asked to take up a position against the Polish people, and they pulled out the Polish brigades, and the order was given, ready, aim. The Russian units behind them noticed that the Polish units pivoted, and they all still held their rifles, but now instead of pointing at the Polish people, they were leveled at the Russian officers and soldiers. At that point, the Soviet leaders realized that there was about to be a sea change. And all across Europe, by 1989, that wall was down and societies were suddenly free. And a lot of the consequence of that was this messaging, including Reagan's message to President Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And I think today about the momentum we had then and the fact that for quite some time we've lost this emphasis. We've lost the ability to convey for generations now the type of enthusiasm that Reagan had for spreading the message of individual liberty and freedom, that Kennedy effectively communicated to the world as we talk to people from that generation. And I think it is time we got our footing, because the flip side of our efforts to spread information is the realization that as far as the Chinese Communist Party was concerned, as far as the KGB officer, colonel who became president of Russia were concerned, they were learning that rather than spread and liberate and take surrogate radio and take people from a community to transmit information about what was going on in the world, they would take and change reality for people not only in their own country, but would change the reality for people, for example, in Mali, in West Africa, where they would tell them instead, at a time when the United States are involved in fighting malaria, that the U.S. is engaged here in order to give West Africans malaria. That's what the U.S. does all over Africa. It spreads malaria. We'll get into a little bit the engagement of the Russians, but at this overarching theme of having disinformation not only internally, where totalitarian governments increasingly, like the book 1984, if you think back to your high school and college courses, in which a totalitarian society not only misinforms its own countrymen, but now on steroids is able across the world to conduct these campaigns of influence with information which is demonstrably false, but is intended to undermine democracies, undermine the idea of free elections, intended to undermine the concept that a government which is based upon freedom of speech and individual liberty is a better system. All of that is under attack right now. So as we measure the impact and the familiarity with these messages, we're able now to be able to track, and over the last few years, China just overtook Britain, with the BCC, with the British Broadcasting Corporation, and with other methodologies. Britain, for many years, had quite an imprint along with the United States. Today, Beijing has surpassed that capability that Britain had to influence the world, and is now number 2 behind the United States. This is worldwide, but on particular continents where Beijing is applying a special focus, we'll find that they are really making gains that in some cases put them in the lead. The National Endowment for Democracy is the entity that came up with the concept of sharp power. The NED was formed by Reagan as part of this concept he had of spreading the idea of not just democratic states, but just economic freedom as well as personal freedom. And their networks and Chinese state-backed Confucius Institutes are two examples of what we call sharp power, because it's not just about soft power in the sense, that you're engaged because you have PEPFAR on the ground and you're fighting AIDS, and that was one of the most successful things that we did. President Bush launched that, and in a bipartisan way, Congress engaged to do that. But in this case, we're talking about sharp power, which is actually disinformation campaigns. And we have an alliance, as you know now, between Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea that are all involved in these types of activities, each in their area of influence. This reflects China's Belt and Road Initiative, the railways, the ports, and pipelines. Now, this is part of soft power. We're trying to compete with this effort now with our own initiatives of the International Development Finance Corporation, which is a bill which passed the Senate when I was, or the House and Senate when I was chairman, and is now in law. Ted Yoho and I were the authors of it. And what we are now trying to do is to set up the capacity through loan guarantees, through allowing private equity to be orchestrated as part of this solution, by having our own foreign service officers in every embassy attuned to what can be done to go head on head, whether it's energy projects or transportation projects with Beijing's Belt and Road, but also very importantly, having our U.S. embassies overseas walk every country through the reality of what the terms are in the loan agreements that they're doing with China, because loan sharking, basically, is what a lot of them represent. Where those assets are attached, China will take those ports, as they do, if you cannot pay the usurious interest rates that many of those garner. So this is an example of the expanse that we have seen. This is the U.S. versus China aid and development funding. So in blue, you see the new Development Finance Corporation, which we've set up now in the U.S. In gray, you see the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is deployed with certain specific governments. We have USAID in red, and then the Belt and Road Initiative is in yellow, and that shows the totality of China's engagement here. If you notice, between 2023 and 2024, a 30% increase by focus on the Belt and Road Initiative by Beijing. Folks, a 30% increase in 1 year is absolutely incredible. And when you have a totalitarian state-run society, you're able to funnel that type of money into projects. We do ours more with, the private sector and NGO groups and so forth. But I just want you to see the magnitude. Here's another graph that sort of shows the same thing. Now, soft power competition in Africa. This takes a look at Russia and China's influence as contrasted with the United States. This is one area where both Russia and China simultaneously work together. Russia, especially in the Sahel region and in West Africa, China and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. But as you see, country by country, if you were to take an average, China barely ekes out 59 to 58% in terms of impact on. Now here is a basic question that we want to know the answer to. Africans on the best model for development, U.S. or China. Now, as China engages in this way, you see, especially take a look at Burkina Faso and Mali. One of the reasons, by the way, that the best model being the model of democracy in the West is specifically because of Russia's campaign on malaria. That has really impacted what people think about the truth of U.S. engagement. That is why it is very, very important that our counter battery work, or our countering of this, be better honed, be better communicated. Beijing, by the way, has hired so much of the talent in journalism across Africa to write for their magazines or to do broadcasts in English or French on their stations. And they are very, very focused on using that in order to dissuade people from the concept of democratic governance. The man who originally introduced me to this concept was Colin Powell. And as we were traveling across Africa, the former Secretary of State and former Secretary of Defense walked me through how shocking it was that so many African leaders were actually alluding to us in conversations about the fact that Beijing was there engaged, pushing the idea that whatever election they had should be the last one. There should not be another election. Because look at the problems with democracy and look how much better run things were under President Xi, who was a dictator for life, right? And so this has an effect and wears down a public perception. Here's the Russian influence operations right now in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and you see the types of different TV programming, filming. What this doesn't show is the strength of their internet communications. And that is where they do a lot of disinformation work as well. This shows disinformation campaigns across Africa. That is the Russian flag there, the white, blue, and red. And the number of campaigns that they have going. First is disinformation, but then it's actual engagement with troops on the ground. And that's what I'd like to show you next. This is coup attempts in Africa. The ones you see across the central belt of Africa were ones engineered by the Russians. The successful ones are in the darker color. The pink color is the unsuccessful in the Central African Republic. The reality is that once you have these influence campaigns, and how many here know about the Wagner deployments and the Wagner activities across Africa? So this shows the actual Wagner military deployments. How many are aware of the loss of life in Sudan in terms of the war in Sudan? All right, it is absolutely catastrophic. And it's actually the Janjaweed that were approached by the Wagner forces first, that were armed by them. But their concept was to overturn the governance of the economist from civil society who was at that point in time governing Sudan under a collective endeavor, and try to cause an uprising. So they worked two factions at once. The old Janjaweed, which they began to call the Rapid Reaction Forces, and they worked the military to have a coup. They had them working together, but then the Russians, once they overturned the government, then decided their best follow-up approach was to have the actual Janjaweed, because they would give them the best deal. So now there's a civil war between those two factions going on there. The war in Liberia, in Libya, the war in Libya continues because of the Russian engagement on the Libyan front. You can see the French troop withdrawals in 3 countries there. Again, these are countries that had a democratic elected government. Maybe the government was sending representation, to the French Parliament. But the theme was, we need a strong leader with ties to Russia. We need a leader who will say no to the West. We need a leader that isn't going to fall for these false values, democracy, by the way, being one of them. And so military officers in each of these cases orchestrated these coups d'etats. Another level of engagement affecting the projection of soft power is trade around the globe. And here again, let's look first at the U.S. trade deficit with China. When you have conversations with Beijing officials, they tell you, well, we have 2 different systems. You have to respect our system, but under our system, we decide what comes into our country because we are the government, and we decide what people need. And under your system, your markets are open, so you need to be open to what we export to your market. Well, as you can see, the differential of 3-to-1 between trade with China, which is the worst balance you can find, has an eroding effect because they're looking to strengthen their system and intentionally weakening ours, not only the U.S., but if we look at Europe, trading goods with China, the Chinese model is the same thing. It's not to have open markets with Europe, it's to decide what comes into the country and then decide that the Europeans should be open to the dumping of goods from China. To be frank about this, our best policy would be one where we worked with the Europeans together and we finally make Beijing pay the social costs. Economists like Frederick Hayek said, when you have a system and you're polluting and other countries are not, or other companies are not, there should be an assessment specifically. And you can call that assessment whatever you want. You could call it tariff, but there should be an assessment on the country or the company that does that does not play by the rules. And I would suggest that that would be the place to really start in terms of focusing human action on the question of how we deal with the trade imbalance with Beijing. And so that sort of concludes my overview of what I was asked to share. I appreciate Owen Holmes and certainly those who are engaged in the World Affairs Council, at CSUF as well, and the Orange County Forum in helping bring us together, but also in terms of your decision to pick this theme this year in order to kick this off. We will be hearing from the panels afterwards. And at this point, Owen, why don't we open it up for questions?
Got 2 mics, one this side, one that side. Okay. Amber will take care of you, Chris.
Question?
Yeah, it's not only our adversaries that we have trade imbalances with, some of our allies as well. Mexico, Canada, and so on. So what do you think we should do in those situations?
I think they also suffer under the dumping of goods. And I think we should try to work out an agreement where we're open to liberalize trade with them, they're open to liberalize trade with us, because we're playing by the same set of rules. That does mean some adjustments on these rules in cases like dairy and so forth on the part of Canada. We reach a common accord that we're going to treat each other equally, but that because we play by the international rules and we have Beijing that violates those rules on a regular basis, that's where we jointly commit to put on those tariffs. And that includes Mexico tariffing goods coming in from China that will later be resold in the United States, including automobiles, etc. Other questions?
Question for this side of the room?
Oh, sorry. Mr. Royce, thank you for, thank you for bringing attention to the soft power. I think that's the hardest thing sometimes to communicate in today's world is the importance and the role U.S. can play in the soft power with our allies around the world. Can you elaborate in today's political situation, how do we bring both parties together to make sure that we continue to have the impact we have around the world and and be able to use the soft power?
I think there are probably some compromises that could be made going forward that would reach a bipartisan conclusion that perhaps we could be more effective in how we do this. I do think it's time to fold USAID into the State Department, and I think at the same time we have to recognize how successful PEPFAR and other programs like this have been. So they need to remain focused, but they also need to be structured in a way that they are pushing U.S. values and U.S. interests, on the continents where we engage in this activity. I think that's the kind of compromise that probably could come out of a bipartisan focus on how to make these better programs. Judge?
Congressman Royce, first of all, you have my vote for president.
Hear, hear.
Secondly, I fault the media and I fault our government. China is doing all kinds of things that are horrendous. The cybersecurity, they're doing it blatantly. If they're harvesting people's organs while they're still, all that, we should get that word out to people. And that will make a huge difference in the world's perception of China. Why are we not doing that?
Well, let me first respond with a very Sherman-esque retort to the idea of me running for anything. My observation is that what we all need to be doing right now is what you're saying the media should be doing right now, which is educating all of our fellow citizens, using whatever position we have with honest statements exactly. Because if you put out disinformation, you're not going to be trusted any more than the people of Eastern Europe trusted what they were hearing, from controlled radio and television emanating from Moscow. But we now have an adversary that is far more clever. This KGB colonel has spent a lot of time learning. He says the most catastrophic thing that happened in the former century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Wow. If you really believe that's the most catastrophic event that happened in a century, which saw 50 million souls killed in the Second World War, you have a warped view of the importance of, and the self-importance of the KGB. But because of his training, he has focused them, as I've shown you, including the malaria campaign, and I could cite many others. We need, to appeal to our media, to get these messages out, to explain what's going on. We do not have the foreign correspondents we had during the Cold War, or certainly during the Second World War. Media needs to take on and move from entertainment and focus on specifically real news, including what our adversaries really are doing, because it is now a national security issue. It is an issue for the health of democracy. And so I appreciate you raising that issue, Judge. Other questions?
My main question is, do you think that China and Russia are using the BRICS coalition to influence their point of views, on other countries in a more related trade and economic environment, or do you think that they're just doing it just to help the world, in like how NATO is and the World Trade Organization?
Yeah, we could make the argument that, well, maybe they're simply doing it, right, for economic purposes. They're selling their model, they're trying to open up for their exports, except that their engagement, as Secretary Powell explained to me, always comes along with this additional, especially once they get a little leverage, this additional suggestion to leaders around the world. Again, make this election your last election. By the way, on courts, on independence of the courts, the Americans are misleading you with the African Growth and Opportunity Act. They're suggesting to you that they've opened their markets, and in exchange you're supposed to move towards independent judges. No, that's a disaster. Do not set up an independent judiciary. Thirdly, on information. You don't want all kinds of information out there. You want only truthful information that is controlled by you. We suggest your brother-in-law. Now, this is a real-world example. He should run information in your country, but the most important aspect is shut down those that are criticizing in any way your government. And if you go with us, and by the way, we're bringing you Huawei, we're bringing you ZTE, we'll be able to monitor the conversations of your political enemies. So this is going to get a lot easier. I mean, this is the messaging that I have been worried about for a long time, but now I see that this is reaching critical mass because they're also talking to the Iranians, right? And if we move to hard power for a minute, what does that mean? It means that suddenly if you're running, a military drill, you're also asking Iran, how many missiles can you send over to Moscow, over to the front? And how many artillery shells can the North Koreans send? North Korea, can you send some troops as well? Great. So they are not just doing this economically in collaboration. They're also doing it on messaging because their end goal in each case is their adversary is not just the United States. It is democratic governments around the world which are pushing an alternative to their ideal. And for the Chinese Communist Party, their ideal now is all in one man, just as the Russians had this under Joe Stalin. I mean, it's the cult now of the personality again, right? I mean, we saw it under Chairman Mao. Now Xi is president for life. It is really time that we factor this into how we interpret this. And most importantly, that the next generation of students are acquainted with the magnitude of the challenge and the antidote to it, which is true information.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. The first one here and another one on that side. So, sir.
Hi, Congressman Royce. I do appreciate your concern on soft power. I especially consider my peers really had the idea of soft power as in consideration of the student panel. But I also question this. Do you believe we should have a balance of our hard power and concerning that we might need to prepare for at least a partial mobilization for our military? Or do you think...
Do I believe that we should have... State that again.
Should we at least consider partial mobilization of the military? Or should we go all out on our soft power?
No, we need a credible deterrence. I appreciate your question. A credible deterrence is a military that is strong enough that, totalitarian governments will not attack democratic states. But to go back to President Roshan's point, you need allies. So we need the United States, we need other democratic allies, we need those allies to step up. We need those allies to pay their share of the burden, right? The other aspect of this is that we also need then the soft power that we're talking about today. And I would just pick one example because sometimes hard power is a rough it's a rough thing to deploy, but when others deploy it against you, if you do not respond in kind, democratic states can find themselves in trouble. I remember when Iran attacked one of our ships, blew part of the ship up, and President Reagan responded by sinking half of their fleet to the bottom of the Persian Gulf. That is an example of hard power. We would prefer Reagan's first preference. Soft power is persuasion, it's information, it's ideals. Let's try to use that. Let's reserve the hard power only when we need it, and let's keep it as a credible threat of retaliation for those that might attempt a Pearl Harbor or whatever example. One last question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Royce. You spoke earlier about misinformation, disinformation, et cetera. Because we're coming into this new AI-driven landscape where misinformation and disinformation can be spread quite unlike the way it had been before, especially by Russia, China, et cetera. Do you believe that there are any practical ways to prevent this from happening,
Yes.
to like address these issues because of the technological evolution that happens so quickly? Like, is there a way to do that?
I think that's a great question. I mean, one way is to amplify and get the media to follow examples of this. But after the Russian invasion of 2014 into eastern Ukraine, and as a consequence, I led a delegation as chairman, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. We talked with civil society, everybody in the East, in the Donbass region, and got their input, and found that even the former Russian-leaning people were telling us, at the end of the day, we've got to figure out how we get the Russians out of here. We may not like Kyiv, but we've got to figure out what we do about this. I would suggest that our best policy is to work proactively. In that case, I introduced a bill which we passed into law for sanctions on Russia for 2 reasons, as we discussed at the time. One was their invasion, and secondarily was their disinformation in the United States, because they were setting people against each other intentionally, trying to set up, for example, protests and counter-protests to create racial violence. We have actual evidence of exactly how they did this. People need to be focused on this, but secondarily, we can better intercept this now because we are spending a lot more time following what these groups out of Moscow and and in Beijing, what they're doing in disinformation campaigns. And the pushback should be instantaneously like that. And it should include sanctions and efforts that really get in the headlines and put counter pressure. So those would be my observations.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a hand to Congressman Royce for a keynote.